The desert base didn't sleep, not really. Generators coughed, radios crackled, and boots scuffed across gravel long after the sun dipped behind the ridgelines. For the 600 men and women stationed there, war wasn't something waiting at the perimeter fence. It was already inside, beating in their chests, rattling their nerves, stealing their sleep. And that night, war arrived in the form of a colonel who lost his temper. Colonel Briggs was a big man, barrel-chested, voice like gravel dragged across steel. He believed in breaking soldiers down before he built them up, believed in discipline that bordered on cruelty. 4 weeks, he'd been pushing them harder, barking orders until voices cracked, punishing hesitation with brutal drills under the burning Afghan sun. And tonight, with everyone packed into the mess hall for a motivational address, he crossed a line. The mess hall was sweltering. 600 soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, sweat running down their spines, hands clasped behind their backs. They tried to look attentive, but fatigue drooped eyelids and clenched jaws. Briggs paced the front like a wolf, his boots pounding the plywood stage. "You think this war cares if you're tired?" he roared. Spit sprayed from his mouth. "You think the enemy's gonna give you a water break? They're waiting out there right now, waiting for you to blink, waiting for you to screw up, waiting to kill you." His fist slammed a podium so hard the microphone squealed. "You will not screw up." A ripple of nervous laughter swept the ranks, quickly swallowed. But Briggs noticed. His eyes, sharp and mean, scanned the room like a spotlight until they landed on a skinny private in the front row. "Was that funny to you, Private Hall?" The kid froze. His Adam's apple bobbed. "And no, sir." Briggs descended from the stage, each stomp heavier than the last. He got in Hall's face, so close their noses nearly touched. "Drop and give me 50. Right here. In front of everyone." Hall hesitated. "Now." The kid dropped, palms slapping the dusty linoleum. He started pumping push-ups, his body trembling after the first 10. The colonel crouched beside him, screaming numbers in his ear. And then he kicked him. Not hard enough to break ribs, but hard enough to send Hall sprawling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. 600 pairs of eyes locked on the scene. Briggs straightened, chest heaving. "That is weakness," he growled, pointing down at the boy. "And weakness gets us killed." Silence. Until a voice rose from the back. "Come." Unshaken. Almost amused. Or maybe bad leadership does. Every head swiveled. It wasn't a lieutenant. Not a sergeant. Not even one of the seasoned combat vets. It was the janitor. An older man, graying hair under a sweat-stained cap, stood with a mop in one hand and a rag dangling from his pocket. His name was Marcus Reed, ex-Army, though most of the new recruits didn't know it. He kept to himself, fixed things, mopped floors, whistled old blues tunes when the night stretched long. Nobody thought much about him. Until now. Briggs turned slowly, like a predator locking onto prey. His voice dropped an octave. "What did you just say?" Reed leaned on his mop, unfazed. "I said maybe it ain't the kid's weakness that'll get people killed. Maybe it's a colonel who thinks breaking bones is the same thing as building discipline." The hall went dead still. Soldiers held their breath. The colonel's face turned crimson. "You're a janitor," he sneered. "You don't get to open your mouth in my army." Reed's eyes glinted. "Funny thing is, Colonel, I was in your army. Twice deployed. Saw more men die from reckless orders than from fear. And I'll tell you something, if the enemy was here right now they'd be laughing. Because the man shouting loudest is the one who just lost control." Murmurs spread like wildfire through the ranks. The colonel's authority was cracking and everyone felt it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Briggs lunged forward, jabbing a finger into Reed's chest. "You're done here." His voice was venom. "Pack your things. You're off this base tonight." And that's when Reed did something no one expected. He stepped up, not back, and with 600 soldiers watching, he placed his hand gently but firmly on the colonel's wrist and lowered it. Not with violence. Not with rage. Just a quiet strength that froze Briggs in place. "Careful," Reed said softly. "You've already lost their respect. Don't lose what little control you've got left." For the first time, Colonel Briggs didn't have a comeback. His lips worked but no sound came. 600 soldiers stood in stunned silence as Reed turned, picked up his mop bucket, and walked out of the mess hall like nothing had happened. What no one knew was that by sunrise, Reed would no longer be a janitor. Because before dawn, the base came under fire. It started with the whistle of rockets slicing through the dark. The first explosion lit the horizon like lightning, followed by the bone-shaking thunder of impact. The barracks trembled. Soldiers tumbled from bunks, scrambling into gear as alarms blared. Shouts echoed through the compound, "Incoming! Incoming!" Briggs' voice barked over the loudspeakers, ordering units to defensive positions. But in the chaos, confusion reigned. Radios jammed. Half the squads didn't know where to go. And then Reed appeared. He wasn't in janitor's rags anymore. He'd thrown on old fatigues, dusty and patched, but his bearing was unmistakable, steady, commanding, alive in the storm. He strode through the chaos, grabbing panicked privates by the shoulders, pointing them toward cover. "You 3 north wall. You get that .50 up and running. Move." The soldiers obeyed without hesitation. Maybe they didn't know why, maybe they shouldn't have, but Reed's voice carried something Briggs had lost: trust. Another rocket screamed overhead, slamming into the motor pool. Flames roared, throwing jagged shadows across the compound. Screams cut the night as medics rushed toward the injured. Briggs was shouting into a radio, demanding artillery support, but nobody seemed to hear him. His orders were tangled, contradictory. And then Reed climbed onto a Humvee, his silhouette cutting sharp against the firelight. "Listen up," he bellowed, voice ringing clear. "You want to live through this? You follow me. Sector Bravo is thin. We hold that line or we're finished. Grab ammo, grab cover, and move like hell. Go." 600 soldiers, scared, shaken, bleeding, moved. Not because a colonel told them to. Because the janitor had stepped up. The night turned savage. Mortars fell like rain, the walls shook, and tracer fire stitched the darkness. Reed led from the front, dragging wounded men behind sandbags, shoving extra magazines into empty hands, cracking jokes in the middle of gunfire just to cut the fear. "Hey kid," he shouted to Hall, the same Private Briggs humiliated hours before. "You still owe me 50 push-ups. You don't die tonight, we'll call it even." Hall grinned through the blood on his face. "Yes, sir." Nobody called him janitor anymore. They called him sir. And somewhere deep in the smoke and chaos, Colonel Briggs stood watching. His men no longer looked to him. They looked to the man with the mop who had just silenced him hours earlier. Briggs' jaw clenched. Because he knew. Marcus Reed wasn't just saving lives tonight. He was taking the army back from him. The smoke over the compound hadn't cleared by dawn. It hung low, stinging eyes, choking throats, clinging to every scrap of fabric. The base smelled of burnt diesel, cordite, and blood. Bodies lay under ponchos lined against the wall, soldiers who hadn't made it through the night. Some had died instantly in the first barrage. Others bled out before medics could reach them. 600 soldiers had stood in that mess hall the night before. By sunrise, 22 were gone. Colonel Briggs stood stiff near the command tent, his uniform smudged with ash but his chin still high. He was barking orders at the staff officers, demanding casualty reports, demanding drone coverage, demanding answers no one could give. But no one was listening to him. They were listening to Marcus Reed. Reed crouched near the shattered motor pool, his hands black with soot as he helped lift a charred piece of debris off a trapped corporal. His voice was calm, steady. "Easy now. That's it. We've got you." The corporal whimpered, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Reed caught the medic's eye and nodded. "Tourniquet high on the thigh. He'll make it if we move fast." The medic obeyed. No hesitation. Reed had no rank. No authority. But after last night, his word carried weight. The soldiers had seen him under fire, saw him steady hands that shook, saw him turn fear into action. In chaos, people don't look for titles. They look for leaders. And Reed had become one. By mid-morning, the base looked like a hive of hornets rebuilding after a storm. Sandbags piled higher, gun nests repaired, trenches dug deeper. Soldiers moved with grim purpose, following orders Reed gave in passing. "Shift that Humvee here. Stack ammo there. Eyes on that ridge line." Colonel Briggs saw it. And it burned him. He marched toward Reed, boots striking sharp. His voice was a blade. "You will stand down, Reed. Right now. I don't know what game you're playing, but this is my command." Reed straightened, wiping grime from his hands. He didn't raise his voice, didn't square off like a challenger. He simply looked the colonel in the eye, tired but unshaken. "Not playing a game, Colonel. Just keeping soldiers alive. These are my soldiers." Reed's reply was quiet, but it cut deep. "Funny. Last night they didn't look like yours." Briggs' face twitched, fury bubbling beneath the surface. "You think a mop and a couple of war stories make you fit to lead? You're a maintenance man. You fix pipes. You scrub toilets. That's all." Reed let the insult hang in the air. Then he leaned in slightly. "You're right. I fix things. And right now this unit is broken." For a long moment, neither moved. Around them soldiers slowed, listening, waiting. Briggs noticed, and his fury curdled into something sharper: fear. He jabbed a finger at Reed. You so much as give one more order and I'll have you court-martialed. You'll rot in a cell before you see another sunrise. Reed didn't flinch. If we survive tonight, you can lock me up all you want. That night, survival was far from guaranteed. The enemy hit again, harder this time. Not probing fire, an assault. RPGs slammed the walls. If-47 burst shredded the night. The ridgeline flashed with muzzle fire as militants poured down like a flood. Soldiers scrambled to the perimeter, weapons rattling in frantic bursts. The sky lit with tracers, red and green fireflies buzzing through smoke. Briggs' orders blasted over the radio, but they came jumbled, panicked. First platoon, fall back. No, hold position. Damn it, where's my air support? Reed knew what was happening. He'd seen it before. A commander choking under pressure, clinging to control while the battlefield slipped away. So Reed did the one thing Briggs wouldn't. He left the command tent and ran to the wall. The north wall was cracking. A squad of young soldiers, barely out of training, was pinned under relentless fire. A Humvee turret was jammed, its gunner slumped bleeding in the hatch. Reed vaulted into the gunner's seat, yanking the dead man aside. He slammed the .50 cal's bolt forward and opened fire. The weapon thundered, deafening, ripping the night open. The recoil hammered his shoulders, but Reed's aim was steady, precise. He cut swaths through the militants charging the wire, buying precious seconds for the pinned squad to regroup. Move up. Flank left, he shouted, and the kids obeyed without question. One of them, Private Hall, the same boy Briggs humiliated, crawled beside him, firing bursts from his M4. Hall shouted over the gunfire, "Why the hell are you doing this? You're not even supposed to be here." Reed grinned, teeth white in the muzzle flash. "Kid, nobody's supposed to be in a war. But once you're in it, you fight." Minutes stretched like hours. The enemy pressed harder, surging against the walls, throwing grenades, climbing wire. Reed moved like a man possessed, firing, shouting, dragging wounded behind cover, throwing himself into every gap like he could plug the entire war with his body. At one point, when the machine gun jammed, he dropped down, grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier, and joined the line shoulder to shoulder with the privates. Everywhere he went, morale lifted. Fear hardened into defiance. And everywhere he went, Briggs' absence grew more obvious. Inside the command tent, Colonel Briggs was unraveling. His radio crackled with half reports and static. His map was covered in coffee stains and scribbled arrows. His staff officers exchanged nervous glances. They knew who was holding the line. And it wasn't him. One major leaned close. "Sir, Reed's out there." Briggs' jaw tightened. "I don't care if he's out there juggling grenades. He's not in command. I am." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true anymore. Hours later, when the sky finally paled with dawn, the enemy broke. They melted back into the ridgelines, leaving behind scorched earth, spent shells, and blood. The base had held. Barely. 57 wounded. 12 dead. And one janitor who wasn't a janitor anymore. The soldiers gathered in the yard, exhausted, filthy, their faces streaked with soot and tears. They looked at Reed, not Briggs, for the next word. Reed stood, arms heavy, eyes bloodshot, but his voice carried. "You fought like hell," he said simply. "And you lived. That's all that matters right now. Get your brothers and sisters to the medics. Get some water. Then get ready because they'll be back." A ripple of grim laughter passed through the ranks. Not joy, solidarity. For the first time in weeks, the soldiers felt like a unit. Briggs stepped forward, his shadow long in the morning light. He looked at Reed, then at the men. His voice was stiff. Dismissed. Nobody moved. They waited. For Reed. And when Reed gave a single nod, they finally dispersed. Briggs' face went pale. The army wasn't his anymore. It was Reed's. That night, Reed sat alone on a sandbag wall, staring at the horizon. His mop leaned against the barricade beside him, untouched. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing red in the dark. Private Hall approached, limping from a bandaged leg. He dropped beside Reed, silent for a while, then finally spoke. "You know what people are saying?" Reed exhaled smoke. "Probably that I'm crazy." Hall shook his head. "They're saying you're the only reason we're still breathing." Reed chuckled, bitter. "Don't believe half of what soldiers say. Fear makes heroes out of whoever's still standing." Hall's voice was quiet. "Then I hope you keep standing." Reed didn't answer. He just stared at the ridgeline, where shadows still shifted in the dark. Because he knew Hall was wrong. He wouldn't keep standing forever. And sooner or later, someone, enemy or colonel, was going to make sure of it. The desert never forgives. By the third day, the base was a scar across the earth, smoke still curling from impact craters, walls patched with twisted metal, blood staining the sand dark. The soldiers were exhausted, running on caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer stubbornness. And still the enemy watched from the ridges. Reed could feel it. He'd fought enough wars to know when the battlefield itself was holding its breath. The quiet after the second assault wasn't peace. It was the coil before the strike. Colonel Briggs hadn't spoken to him since the last firefight. Not directly. Orders came down through clipped radio calls, written notes, staff officers running between tents. The colonel stayed locked in the command post, clinging to paperwork and procedure like lifelines. But the soldiers? They came to Reed. They came with questions. Where should we dig the new trench line? Who covers the west approach? How do we stretch rations if the convoy doesn't arrive? Reed gave answers. Not perfect ones, not always what they wanted, but enough to keep them steady. Enough to keep them alive. And that made him dangerous. Because every answer he gave took one more piece of authority away from Colonel Briggs. That morning a patrol failed to return. 10 men had gone beyond the wire to scout the ridgeline. Hours passed. No radio call. No sign. By noon, a single Humvee limped back, windshield shattered, tires shredded. Inside were 3 survivors, half-conscious, covered in blood. The driver, Sergeant Alvarez, stumbled out, face gray. His words slurred through cracked lips. Ambush, Valley Pass, they're waiting for us. Then he collapsed. Reed caught him before he hit the ground. The medic rushed in, but Alvarez's warning echoed in every soldier's mind. The enemy wasn't just testing them anymore. They were baiting them. Colonel Briggs called a meeting. Officers and squad leaders crowded the command tent, maps spread across the table. Briggs' finger jabbed the valley on the grid. We recover those men. We show the enemy they can't touch us without paying for it. A murmur rippled. Everyone knew what that valley was. A killing ground, narrow walls, high ridges perfect for ambush. Reed spoke up. Sir, with respect, that's suicide. They'll have IEDs planted, heavy weapons dug in. You send men down there, you're not bringing them back. Briggs' eyes snapped to him, blazing. I didn't invite you to speak. Reed ignored the sting. We wait, they'll come to us. They always do. We hold the walls, fortify, bleed them when they attack on our ground. A captain across the table shifted uncomfortably. Colonel. Reed's got a point. Briggs' voice rose, sharp as broken glass. We don't wait. We act. We strike back before they tighten the noose. My decision stands. The room went silent. Reed's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed to stop this madness. But he caught the eyes of the younger soldiers watching, uncertain, afraid, and he knew pressing now would split the unit worse than any enemy ambush. So he said nothing. But in his silence, a decision was already forming. The rescue convoy rolled out at dusk. 3 Humvees, 20 men, engines rumbling low. Reed wasn't on the roster. Briggs had made sure of it. But Reed was there anyway, slipping into the rear Humvee, rifle across his lap. The young lieutenant in charge shot him a nervous look. You're not supposed to be here. Reed's reply was flat. Neither are you. The lieutenant didn't argue. The valley was a scar in the earth, its mouth gaping black against the twilight. The Humvees crawled forward, tires crunching gravel, engines echoing off the walls. Every soldier's knuckles were white on their rifles. They could feel it, the trap closing. Halfway in, the first explosion hit. An IED tore the lead Humvee apart in a fireball, shrapnel ripping through the dusk. Men screamed, thrown into the air like rag dolls. Gunfire erupted from the ridges, AK bursts, RPG trails, the rattle of PKM machine guns. The valley became a furnace of light and death. Contact! Contact! The lieutenant shouted, voice breaking. Chaos swallowed the convoy. Soldiers dove for cover behind burning wrecks, returning fire blindly at muzzle flashes above. Reed moved like a man who'd lived this nightmare before. He dragged a bleeding private behind cover, snapped off controlled bursts at the ridgeline, then grabbed the lieutenant by the collar. Get your men in a perimeter. Tight circle. Return fire or we're all dead. The lieutenant blinked, frozen. Reed slapped him hard across the face. Now. Something clicked. The lieutenant started barking orders. Men pulled together, rifles hammering, grenades arcing into the rocks. The ambush was brutal, but disorganized defense became coordinated resistance. Still, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned in the killing ground. Reed crawled to the radio man, headset crackling with static. He yanked it on. "This is Bravo Convoy. We are under heavy fire in the valley. Request immediate support. Repeat, immediate support." The reply was Colonel Briggs' voice, cold and distant. "You disobeyed orders, Reed. You're not authorized to be out there." Reed's blood ran cold. "We've got wounded. Men dying. Get U.S. air support now." Briggs' tone didn't change. "Negative. You'll hold your position until further notice." Reed realized the truth in that moment. Briggs wasn't going to save them. If Reed lived, Briggs lost the war for command. If Reed died in the valley, problem solved. The colonel was leaving them to die. The firefight raged on. Ammunition dwindled. The enemy pressed closer, bold now, firing from the rim of the valley, shouting in languages Reed barely understood but had heard too many times before. And Reed knew, if they stayed they were done. He made the call. "Listen up," he shouted over the gunfire. "We're not waiting for rescue. We're breaking out. Load the wounded, grab what ammo you can carry, and we push east. It's open ground. It's our only shot." A sergeant cursed. "We'll get cut down in the open." Reed snapped back. "We'll get buried here if we don't move. You want to die in a ditch or die running with a rifle in your hands?" The sergeant hesitated, then nodded. "Running." That was all it took. The breakout was hell. They lifted the wounded onto shoulders, dragged them through dust and blood, sprinted between bursts of machine gun fire. Reed led from the front, charging through the haze, rifle barking until the bolt locked empty. He reloaded, kept going. RPGs screamed overhead, slamming into the walls. Shards of rock rained down. Men stumbled, fell, but others grabbed them, hauled them forward. Reed shouted until his throat bled. "Keep moving. Don't you stop. Not one of you stops." The eastern ridge loomed ahead, jagged and sharp, silhouetted against the rising moon. If they reached it, they had a chance. If not. Bullets whipped past Reed's head, one grazing his helmet, spinning him sideways. He hit the ground, ears ringing. Hall, young, terrified Hall, was suddenly there, grabbing his arm, hauling him up. "Come on, sir. You said don't stop." Reed staggered up, vision blurred, but he ran. And somehow, impossibly, they made it. They broke through the eastern mouth of the valley, stumbling into open desert, bodies collapsing in the sand. Behind them, the enemy fire tapered off, unwilling to chase too far into the flat kill zone of American artillery range. They had escaped. Barely. Out of 20 men, 13 were left. 7 lay dead in the valley, their bodies unrecoverable. Reed sank to his knees in the sand, chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut on his temple. Around him, survivors sobbed quietly, clutching each other, clutching the wounded still clinging to life. Hall dropped beside him, face streaked with tears and dirt. "We made it," he whispered. "We actually made it." Reed didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the horizon, where the valley still smoldered with gunfire and smoke. Because he knew the truth. They hadn't been ambushed by mistake. They'd been sent there to die. When the convoy limped back to base hours later, silence fell across the compound. Soldiers stopped what they were doing, watching the bloodied survivors stumble through the gates. Briggs stood waiting. His expression was stone. "You disobeyed orders," he said coldly. "You'll be placed under arrest." Reed stared at him, filthy, burned, exhausted beyond words. Then he spoke low so only Briggs could hear. "No, Colonel. You disobeyed them. You left us out there. You left your own men to die." For the first time, Briggs looked away. The surviving soldiers saw it. And in that instant, the last thread of his authority snapped. That night, Reed sat alone again, staring at his mop propped against the wall. The irony bit deep. He'd spent years cleaning up other people's messes. And now, somehow he was cleaning up a war. But this mess was bigger than anything he'd ever faced. Because Briggs wasn't finished. And Reed knew the colonel would rather burn the entire desert down than let a janitor steal his command. The desert sun rose red that morning, bleeding across the horizon like a warning. Inside the compound, the air was thick with smoke, dust, and distrust. Word of the ambush had spread fast. Soldiers whispered in the chow line, in the barracks, at the perimeter posts. 13 survivors had staggered back under Reed's lead, while 7 brothers were left in the valley. The story twisted with every retelling. Some said Briggs had ordered them into a death trap. Others said Reed had saved them single-handed. Some whispered both were true. But one fact was undeniable. The colonel had abandoned his men. Reed woke on a cot in the medic tent, bandaged and aching. His body screamed for rest, but the compound buzzed outside with rumors and tension. Hall slipped in carrying a tin cup of bitter coffee. He set it down and whispered, "They're saying Briggs wants you arrested." Reed rubbed his temple. "Doesn't surprise me. He told the officers you disobeyed direct orders. Said you endangered the mission." Reed gave a humorless laugh. "Funny. Thought the mission was keeping soldiers alive." Hall hesitated, eyes darting to the flap of the tent. "Sir, what happens if he pushes it? What happens if they actually put you on trial?" Reed sipped the coffee, bitter as the desert itself. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Then the war inside these walls will kill us faster than the one outside." By noon the summons came. Reed was escorted to the command tent by 2 MPs. His mop and bucket, still leaning against his bunk, felt like relics of another life. Now he walked in fatigues caked with dust and blood, a soldier without rank but carrying more weight than he ever wanted. Inside, the tent smelled of sweat, paper, and rage. Colonel Briggs sat behind a folding table, officers flanking him like vultures. A small crowd of soldiers lingered outside, straining to hear through the canvas. Briggs' voice was sharp as a blade. "Marcus Reed, you stand accused of insubordination, dereliction of duty, and unauthorized engagement in combat operations. How do you plead?" Reed stared at him. "Not guilty. Unless saving soldiers' lives is a crime now." Murmurs rippled through the tent. Briggs' face flushed. "You defied direct orders. You compromised this unit's structure." Reed leaned forward, eyes hard. "Structure? Colonel, you sent men into a valley you knew was a death trap. You left them there. If I hadn't acted, none of us would have come back. That's not structure, that's slaughter." The tent went silent. One major cleared his throat. "With respect, sir." Reed's actions did save lives. Briggs slammed his fist on the table. "And what happens next time? What happens when every private thinks he knows better than command? We'll have anarchy." Reed's reply was steady. "No, sir. You don't lose men to anarchy. You lose them to arrogance." The words hung heavy. Outside, soldiers shifted, whispering. Briggs realized the trial wasn't about Reed anymore. It was about him. And he was losing. The hearing ended without a verdict. Briggs dismissed the room, his jaw clenched, eyes promising vengeance. As Reed stepped out into the blinding sun, soldiers surrounded him. Some clapped his shoulder. Some nodded silently. Some just looked at him like he was already their commander. Briggs saw it all through the tent flap. And in that moment, a seed of hatred rooted deep in his chest. That night the enemy struck again. Not with rockets this time. With silence. Guards at the east wall reported movement in the shadows, whispers on the wind. But no gunfire followed. Just pressure. Just waiting. Reed stood watch with Hall and a squad of jittery privates. He could feel the enemy out there, testing, circling, preparing. Hall muttered, "Why don't they hit us?" Reed kept his eyes on the ridgeline. "Because they want us afraid. Afraid enough to make mistakes." And sure enough, the mistake came from inside. A flare lit the night, fired from the command tent. Soldiers snapped to alert, weapons raised. A voice blared over the PA. "Alpha and Bravo companies, forward positions now. Push east and sweep the valley." Reed's blood ran cold. Briggs. Again. The East Valley was the same ground that had almost killed them. Now Briggs was ordering an all-out push into it, 600 strong. Hall's face drained. "He'll get us all killed." Reed clenched his jaw. "Not if I can stop it." He sprinted to the parade ground, where soldiers were already mustering, confusion in their eyes. Trucks revved, weapons clattered, officers barked orders they barely believed themselves. Reed vaulted onto a truck bed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold it. Hold it right there." Hundreds of heads turned. "You step into that valley tonight, you don't come back. You all know it. You've seen it." Murmurs rippled, soldiers hesitating. Briggs stormed from the command tent, face purple with rage. "Stand down, Reed. That's an order." Reed didn't move. "Last time he left us to die. You think he won't do it again?" Briggs shoved forward, eyes wild. "You are not in command here." Reed met his glare. "No. But neither are you. Not anymore." The air crackled. 600 soldiers stood frozen, torn between two men, one with rank, one with trust. Briggs' hand dropped to his sidearm. The gesture was slow, deliberate. The crowd tensed. Reed's voice cut sharp. "Colonel, you draw that weapon, you better be ready to use it on your own men. Because I swear to God, they won't follow you into that valley." The silence was deafening. Then one by one soldiers lowered their rifles. Engines cut. The formation dissolved, not toward Briggs but away from him. The colonel's hand trembled on his pistol. Then he let it fall. He had lost. From that night forward, command shifted. Not officially, not on paper. Briggs still signed the reports, still wore the silver eagle on his collar. But the soldiers looked to Reed. When the perimeter needed reinforcing, they asked Reed. When patrols rolled out, they asked Reed. When the enemy's shadow loomed, they asked Reed. The janitor was no longer a janitor. And the colonel was a ghost in his own camp. But ghosts don't fade quietly. Days later, Reed found Briggs in the supply tent, alone, sipping from a flask. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking. "You think you've won?" Briggs muttered. Reed stood in the doorway, arms folded. "Nobody wins out here, Colonel. We just survive." Briggs' laugh was bitter, broken. "Survive long enough and you'll learn what I did. Men don't need heroes. They need control. And when you can't give it to them, when you let them think for themselves, they eat you alive." Reed shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe they need someone who remembers they're human." Briggs sneered. "Humanity doesn't win wars." Reed's reply was quiet. "Neither does pride." They stared at each other across the dim tent, the war outside momentarily eclipsed by the war inside. And Reed knew something dangerous. Briggs wasn't beaten. Not yet. He was waiting. Watching. And sooner or later he'd make his move. That night Reed couldn't sleep. The desert was too quiet, the shadows too thick. He sat on the wall with his rifle, staring into the darkness. Hall joined him, settling on the sandbag. "Think he'll try something?" Reed didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the ridgeline. Because out there the enemy was moving. And in here the real battle hadn't even started. The desert gave no warning. One moment the compound lay in eerie silence beneath a starlit sky. The next, the earth shook as mortar rounds slammed into the perimeter wall. Sand and stone erupted, alarms wailed, and 600 soldiers scrambled to positions. The long-expected assault had begun. Reed was already awake when the first blast hit. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted to the wall, Hall at his side. Searchlights swept the ridgeline, catching silhouettes. Dozens, then hundreds, enemy fighters pouring down the slopes like a black tide. "Positions. Hold the line." Reed roared, his voice cutting through chaos. Machine guns thundered. Rockets screamed. The night turned to fire. But even as Reed barked orders and steadied terrified privates, a cold truth gnawed at him. This wasn't just an attack. This was the attack. The one Briggs had been baiting them toward all along. And if Briggs still held the power to sabotage them from inside, they were already lost. At the command post, Briggs watched the battle unfold on shaky monitors. His officers shouted over each other, requesting reinforcements here, ammo there, medics everywhere. Briggs raised a trembling hand for silence. His face was pale, his voice low. "Pull the second line back. Let the front collapse." An aide gaped. "Sir? That will do it." Briggs snapped. The order went out. And within minutes, the eastern wall, where Reed and Hall fought shoulder to shoulder, was abandoned by half its defenders. The enemy surged forward, sensing weakness. Reed's men shouted in confusion. "Where the hell are Bravo's gunners?" Hall cried, ducking a spray of bullets. Reed's gut sank. He knew. Briggs was still trying to prove him wrong, even if it killed them all. "Hold the wall." Reed shouted. "Nobody falls back, you hear me? Nobody." But his men were outnumbered, outgunned, pinned down. Ammunition dwindled. The enemy pressed closer, screaming war cries that rattled the bones. Reed crawled to the radio, bullets sparking off stone. "Command, this is Reed. We need reinforcements now or we're finished." Static. Then Briggs' icy voice. "Negative, Reed. Fall back to the inner compound." "That's an order." Reed froze. Around him, soldiers waited for his word. If he obeyed, they'd abandon the wall. The base would fall. If he disobeyed, he'd be committing open mutiny. Again. Reed closed his eyes for a split second. He saw the faces of the men who had followed him into the valley. The ones who had trusted him, lived because of him. He opened his eyes, voice steady. "Command, go to hell." He switched channels. "All units, this is Reed. Hold your ground. Repeat, hold the wall. Reinforcements will come from whoever's still got a spine left." The soldiers roared, defiant. And for the first time in the battle, the enemy stalled. Inside the base, Briggs' face turned purple with rage. "He's finished," he hissed. "I want MPs on that wall. Arrest him mid-fight if you have to." But the MPs didn't move. They stared at their colonel, then at the monitors showing Reed rallying the defense. For the first time they ignored Briggs. The colonel realized with horror. His authority wasn't just slipping. It was gone. The battle raged for hours. Mortars shattered the outer barricades. Machine guns overheated. Men bled and screamed and fought through exhaustion. But every time a position faltered, Reed was there. Hauling sandbags. Dragging the wounded to safety. Cracking a grim joke that made exhausted privates laugh through their fear. At one point, a grenade landed near a cluster of young recruits. Reed Dove snatched it up and hurled it back over the wall just before it detonated. The blast lit the night like lightning and the men cheered his name. Reed, Reed, Reed. The chant rolled along the wall, louder than the mortars, louder than the rockets. And Colonel Briggs, watching from his bunker, felt himself vanish. By dawn the first wave broke. Enemy bodies littered the sand. The ridgelines smoked with the wreckage of their retreat. Exhausted soldiers slumped against sandbags, swapping magazines with shaking hands, wiping blood and dust from their faces. Reed stood among them, leaning on his rifle, chest heaving. His uniform was shredded, his arms streaked with cuts. But his eyes still burned. Hall limped over, grinning weakly. Still standing, huh? Barely. Reed managed to laugh. But we're not done. They'll be back. Hall's grin faded. Then we need to settle things in here. Before Briggs kills us faster than they can. Reed nodded. The external enemy had been beaten back. Now it was time to deal with the traitor inside. They confronted him at noon. The entire garrison gathered in the parade ground, 600 soldiers, silent and waiting. Reed stood before them not by rank but by right. Briggs emerged from his tent, uniform immaculate despite his hollow eyes. He looked around at the soldiers who no longer saluted, no longer obeyed. Men, he began, voice shaking, this insubordination will not stand. You are soldiers of the United States Army. You swore oaths. You. Shut up, someone shouted. The words cut like a bullet. Briggs froze. Reed stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud but it carried. You abandoned us in the valley. You tried to abandon us again last night. You've proven you care more about pride than lives. That ends now. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Briggs' hand twitched toward his sidearm. But this time, every rifle in the compound shifted in unison, barrels aimed squarely at him. The colonel's face crumbled. Sweat beaded on his forehead. You can't do this, he stammered. You'll be court-martialed. Executed. Reed shook his head. No. We'll be alive. For a long moment, the parade ground was silent except for the desert wind. Then Briggs' knees buckled. The pistol slipped from his hand. He sank into the dust, a broken man. No cheers followed. Just silence. The men didn't need vengeance. They needed a leader. And in their eyes they already had one. That night, Reed sat on the wall again, staring at the dark ridgeline. Hall joined him, setting down 2 tin cups of bitter coffee. You think they'll come back tomorrow? Hall asked. Yeah, Reed said. And the next day. And the next. They won't stop until one of us is gone. Hall sipped his coffee, grimacing. So what now? You're not officially in charge. Hell, technically you're still just a janitor. Reed chuckled, low and tired. Guess that makes me the only janitor in history running a war. They sat in silence, listening to the wind. But deep down Reed knew this wasn't over. The enemy would return. And Briggs, broken as he was, might still have one last move left in him. The war wasn't done. Not outside. Not inside. And Reed was caught between both. The days bled together under siege. The enemy ringed the compound tight, cutting off supply lines. No convoys, no airdrops, no reinforcements. Just heat, hunger, and the constant echo of snipers' rifles in the dunes. Every sunrise brought another skirmish. Mortar rounds at dawn, probing attacks at dusk. The enemy didn't need to storm the base anymore. They only had to wait for thirst and fear to do their work. Inside, the men rationed water to half a canteen a day. Meals shrank to dry crackers, beans, and whatever rats the kids from the kitchens managed to trap. The smell of sweat and unwashed bodies clung to every corner of the barracks. Yet somehow the garrison still held together, because Reed held them together. He worked like a machine. By day he inspected defenses, patched sandbags, reassured privates whose hands trembled too much to hold rifles. By night he walked the walls, talking, listening, keeping morale alive with a joke, a story, or just the weight of his presence. The men didn't salute him. They didn't need to. They followed him. But not everyone. Colonel Briggs moved like a ghost among the shadows, stripped of command but still whispering in corners. Some soldiers avoided his gaze. Others pitied him. A few, bitter at Reed's rise, still listened. And that was the danger. Because Reed knew, a man who had lost power but not pride could still destroy them all. It started with sabotage. One morning, Reed found the water tank valves open, gallons of precious supply drained into the desert sand. Later, the armory's padlocks were smashed, crates of ammunition stolen. At night, someone cut the communications line, silencing their last radio link with HQ. Each act was small, deniable. But together they bled the garrison. Hall slammed his fist against the table, teeth bared. It's him. Has to be. Briggs. Reed rubbed his temples, exhaustion carving deep lines in his face. He's cornered. A cornered man is dangerous. Hall spat. Then let's finish it before he does. Reed shook his head. Not yet. The men need unity, not civil war. But in his gut, he knew the storm was coming. The breaking point came on the 5th night of siege. Enemy rockets screamed overhead, hammering the north wall. Soldiers scrambled to reinforce, shouting over the explosions. Amid the chaos, Reed noticed something wrong. The gate, wide, heavy, iron-bolted, was unlocked. He sprinted, heart pounding, and caught a figure in the shadows. Briggs. The colonel strained at the chains, face slick with sweat, hands fumbling to unbar the gate. Beyond, silhouettes moved in the dunes, enemy scouts waiting for their opening. Stop. Reed's voice roared like thunder. Briggs froze, eyes wild. It's over, Reed. We can't win. Better to let them in, negotiate, live. Reed leveled his rifle, fury and disbelief tearing through him. You'd hand 600 men to the enemy? Briggs' voice cracked. They're already dead. Don't you see? You're killing them with your stubbornness. Heroes don't win wars, survivors do. The gate creaked, chains rattling. The enemy crept closer. For a moment, time stopped. Reed saw the man before him, not the colonel, not the uniform, but a soul eaten alive by fear and pride. A man who would rather betray his brothers than admit he had failed them. Reed's voice dropped, quiet, almost mournful. You're not a survivor, Colonel. You're just a coward with rank. Then he pulled the trigger. One shot. Briggs collapsed against the gate, blood blooming across his chest. His eyes went wide with shock, then dimmed. The gate stayed shut. The base lived another day. Silence hung heavy. Soldiers gathered, wide-eyed, staring at Reed with a mix of relief and dread. Hall stepped forward, voice low. You did what had to be done. Reed's hands shook as he lowered the rifle. He had faced ambushes, firefights, sieges. But this, the execution of one of their own, felt heavier than any bullet. He turned to the men. This isn't a victory. Don't cheer. Don't celebrate. We lost a soldier tonight. Remember that. But deep down he knew, they had lost the colonel long before the bullet. The next morning, Reed buried Briggs outside the walls, beneath a pile of desert stones. No ceremony. No words. Just silence. When he returned, the men looked at him differently. Not just with trust. With fear too. The kind of fear reserved for someone who carried the weight of command, and the will to make its hardest choice. Reed felt the distance grow. But he didn't push it away. Distance kept him standing. The siege dragged on. Days blurred, marked only by ration lines and the crack of gunfire. But something shifted. With Briggs gone, sabotage stopped. No more cut wires. No more drained water. The camp steadied, hardened. And Reed realized something terrifying. Briggs' betrayal had nearly killed them. But it had also united them. His death had burned away the last of the division. Now, for better or worse, the garrison was his. Entirely his. On the 7th day the enemy came again. Not probing. Not testing. All in. Hundreds swarmed the dunes, banners black against the sun, voices rising in a roar that shook the sand. Mortars, rockets, machine guns, everything they had unleashed at once. The base trembled under the onslaught. Walls cracked, trenches collapsed. Soldiers screamed for ammo, medics, strength. Reed stood at the center, voice hoarse but unbroken. Hold. Every inch of this dirt is ours. You give it up with blood. He charged where the line buckled, dragged men to their feet, fired until his rifle smoked. The chant rose again, fierce and desperate. Reed. 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 Bullets ripped past him. Shrapnel scorched his arm. But he didn't fall. Couldn't. Not while 600 voices needed him. Not while the enemy pressed at the gate Briggs had tried to open. Not while the war inside and out balanced on a knife's edge. By dusk the sand ran red. The enemy broke again, retreating into the ridges with heavy losses. The compound still stood, barely. Reed slumped against the wall, blood soaking his sleeve, exhaustion dragging him toward the dirt. Hall knelt beside him, panting. "You're still alive," Hall said with a grin that barely held. "Barely," Reed rasped, a faint smile tugging his lips. They sat in silence, staring at the smoking horizon. The base had survived. But Reed knew the siege wasn't over. Supplies were gone. Ammo nearly dry. Reinforcements nowhere in sight. And somewhere beyond those dunes the enemy was regrouping. He didn't know how many more days they could hold. He only knew one thing. The men believed in him now. All of them. And that belief carried a weight heavier than any rifle. A weight Briggs had died trying to escape. Reed tightened his grip on his weapon, eyes hard. The war wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The desert was silent the next morning. Too silent. No mortars. No sniper fire. No movement on the ridgeline. Just heat and dust pressing against the compound walls. The men called it the dead day. A pause before the storm. Reed stood on the gate tower, staring at the dunes through binoculars. His arm was bandaged, his face hollow with exhaustion. Hall climbed up beside him, handing over a battered canteen. "Think they've given up?" Hall asked. Reed shook his head. "No. They're waiting. So are we." He lowered the binoculars. What he saw in the men below made his chest tighten. Hollow eyes. Chapped lips. Hands trembling on rifles. They were running on fumes, food gone, water gone, ammo nearly gone. But not one of them had asked to quit. They weren't following Reed out of hope. They were following him because he refused to fall. And they refused to let him stand alone. At sunset, the horizon lit with fire. The enemy came again. Not in waves, not in probes. This was everything. Hundreds, maybe thousands, surging across the sands with trucks, mortars, and banners black against the blood-red sky. The ground trembled under their boots. Reed's heart hammered, but his voice rang steady. 600 strong. That's what we are. That's what we'll be. We hold until the last round, the last breath, the last man standing. This is our dirt. Our wall. Our brothers. You don't give it up for free, you make them pay for every inch. The soldiers roared. Then the storm hit. The battle was a blur of fire and steel. Mortars shredded the walls. Trucks smashed through barricades. Soldiers fought hand to hand in the trenches, bayonets clashing, fists slamming, screams tearing the night. Reed was everywhere at once, dragging the wounded, rallying broken lines, firing until his rifle jammed, then swinging it like a club. His uniform was torn, his hands bloodied, but his voice never faltered. Hall fought at his side, grinning through bloodied teeth. "You're insane, Reed." Reed slammed a rifle but into an enemy's skull. "Takes one to follow me." Hours passed in chaos. By midnight, the compound was half rubble. Fires burned where the barracks had been. The gate hung twisted, nearly torn apart. And still they held. But Reed knew the truth. They were down to their last magazines, their last grenades. The next push would finish them. He climbed the wall, chest heaving, and shouted into the night. "You want us? Come and take us." The enemy answered with a roar. The final wave surged forward. Something strange happened then. As the enemy closed in, a low rumble rose from the horizon. At first Reed thought it was thunder. Then he saw the lights. Dozens of headlights growing brighter. Engines. Armored vehicles. Choppers cutting through the night sky. Reinforcements. The enemy froze, caught between their prey and the approaching storm of steel. And then the reinforcements opened fire. Missiles streaked into the dunes. Machine guns shredded the charging lines. Helicopters swept low, unleashing rockets that lit the night like sunrise. The enemy broke, scattering into the desert, leaving their dead behind. The siege was broken. Inside the compound, silence fell. Soldiers stared at the reinforcements rolling through the gate, American flags painted on armor, uniforms crisp and clean compared to their ragged state. Some men cheered. Some wept. Some just collapsed where they stood. Hall leaned against Reed, grinning weakly. "We made it, boss. We actually made it." But Reed didn't cheer. Didn't smile. Something gnawed at him. The reinforcements moved too smoothly. Too calm for men arriving at a rescue. Their eyes scanned the compound, not with relief but with calculation. The officer leading them, a Major Reed didn't recognize, strode forward, boots polished, uniform spotless. His smile was sharp, practiced. "Captain Marcus Reed, I presume?" Reed blinked. "Captain?" The officer's smile widened. "Congratulations. By unanimous field report, you've been recognized as acting commander of this garrison. Effective immediately." The men around Reed murmured, some smiling, some confused. Reed studied the officer's eyes. "Cold. Measuring. Something about this didn't feel like rescue. It felt like transfer of ownership. That night, as the wounded were tended and the fires put out, Reed sat alone on the wall, staring into the desert. They had survived the siege, beaten back impossible odds. But Briggs' words echoed in his mind. Heroes don't win wars, survivors do. Reed wasn't sure which one he was anymore. Hall joined him as always, dropping 2 cups of coffee. You're thinking too much. Reed smirked faintly. Somebody has to. Hall sipped his drink, eyes scanning the reinforcements setting up camp. You don't trust them. No, Reed admitted. They didn't come to save us. They came to take over. Hall shrugged. So what? Let 'em. You've done your part. Hell, you did more than anyone ever could. Reed shook his head. This isn't over. Not for us. Not for them. He stared at the horizon, where the enemy had vanished into the dunes. They'll be back. And when they come, I don't know if the men out there, he nodded at the reinforcements, will be the kind we can trust to hold the wall. Hall chuckled, sipping his bitter coffee. Then it's a good thing they've got a janitor who knows how to fight a war. Reed smiled faintly, but his eyes stayed hard on the desert. The siege was broken. The battle was won. But the war, the real war, was only beginning. The end.